So we will go ahead and get started. All of our panelists have arrived just on time. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Groundswell. It's the first day, early in the morning. You've made it, and we appreciate you choosing to be at this panel. So, as you all know, we need to restore so much of our ecosystems, of the way we grow food, of the way we connect, and the way we gather in community. And so on this panel, you'll hear from 5 changemakers and regenerators on how they're closing the gaps to make regeneration and agroecology more accessible. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then we'll hear from each of them. We'll leave time at the end for questions, so definitely write down your questions and let us know, keep them in mind. We'll leave about 20 minutes at the end to hear from all of you. My name is Shanley Mitchell. My background is in rewilding and restoration in Northern California for the past 6 years. We focus on watershed regeneration as well as making forests more resilient after wildfires and preparing forests to be more resilient when wildfires do come. I'm now working with with Christabel here. And so we'll go ahead and introduce each person. Christabel is a co-founder and co-director of Earthed and Advaya. Her work, play, and rest are energized by the fascination with healing our relationship with ourselves, each other, and our environments. In 2015, she and her sister Ruby started the transformative learning platform, Advaya, alongside the nature skills platform and charity Earthed. Her life's purpose is to make nature restoration and personal transformation accessible and irresistible to all. We also have Ed Morrison here. He's inspired by Charles Dowding. Ed Morrison started his first no-dig patch over lockdown in his grandmother's back garden and has been hooked ever since. With an interest in sharing the knowledge of growing, Ed advocates for no-dig, pesticide-free growing, highlighting its benefits for the soil, environment, and people. He founded Roots Allotments to help people bring their food supply into their own hands amidst long waiting lists for allotments in the UK. And then we have Ash Brown. Ash is a co-founder and education coordinator of Ecosystem Restoration Communities, a global grassroots movement that trains everyday people to become ecosystem restorers and agroecologists. She co-produces nationwide training for rewilders and regenerative farmers and runs Ash Brown Wilding, a consultancy for restoring land with native plants. She's also creating a new charity to help people buy land together for rewilding and regenerative agriculture in the UK. And then we have Paul here. Paul is a barrister, Paul Powlesland, a barrister and founders of Lawyers for Nature, an organization that represents the natural world and defends it in its courts. He campaigns for the legal rights of nature, advocating for a legal system that recognizes the intrinsic value of the environment and supports those who seek to protect it. Last but not least, we have Harries at the end. He's an architectural and environmental designer and filmmaker. His work focuses on climate change, ecology, and regenerative cultures. He's a co-founder of Earthrise Studio and the co-founder and chief designer at Juntos Farm, where he integrates integrated design and environmental advocacy to promote systemic practices and solutions. So here you are, meet your panelists. And so in my own background in rewilding and especially understanding forest ecology after a trauma happens to the environment, something I've been really inspired by is after a massive fire, how a forest tends to regenerate. And this is by succession. So first, the tiny plants will come. They'll make the soil healthy again. They'll build strong roots so that the brush can come, so that small bushes can come, and then trees, and then animals, and it'll create what's called an ecosystem island. That ecosystem island will then spread its seeds and create more islands until eventually all of those islands connect and build a healthy landscape again. And so in our own work, we would try to emulate this process by creating healthy islands that would then connect over time. And so we really see each of these people on this panel as one of those islands, making their local area a healthier place. And eventually we're all doing that and can connect this process to create a healthier planet. So thank you all for all that you're doing. Our first question that I would love to hear from all of you, we'll just go straight down the line, is how are you making nature restoration or agroecology more accessible? Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shanley. A few years ago during COVID, I was struck by the contrast between the way that in England people were speaking about farmers and sort of just how kind of the horrible narrative of farmers as being sort of destroyers of the environment, where like that's not true. We should be worshipping and celebrating and kind of protecting the rights of our farmers. And comparing that with what I was learning through Survival International in this research paper they did, that in the Amazon, some of the most fertile areas of the Amazon are fertile because millions of indigenous people were practicing agroecology and going about their lives. So thinking of this sort of stark contrast between what humans for millennia have been doing, and then this idea of get farmers off the land and let's just rewild it instead, which to me is a very dystopian and very scary idea. So I started to ask the question of why and how that's happening, and then at the same time also started to be really sort of falling in love with the power of ecosystem restoration and very inspired by what Ash was doing through ecosystem restoration communities. And started to realize that land workers and indigenous peoples have got all the solutions we need to the climate and ecological crises, and all of the traditional ways of growing food in ways that enable there to be more fertility, more biodiversity, and more health in humans. So then my question was, and this is I was doing with my sister Ruby Reed as well, question was, how do we get this knowledge out there and why are we losing it? So we went about setting up what's now called Earth, which is a open access online nature skills platform, which gives people access to the skills they need, practical skills, in order to restore their local environments or grow food. So we got a course with Paul Powlesland on river restoration, or Charles Downing on no-dig growing, or Nicole Masters on soil restoration, or Jessica Hutchins on Indigenous Maori practices. And the idea is that we're going to keep growing and keep producing these online short courses which are bite-sized and take people through a step-by-step process to empower them to be shifting from these sort of sustainable consumers to ecological citizens. So yeah, that's our focus. And then skills aren't obviously the only thing that are preventing people from restoring their local environments. It's also that community and network support that's so important to keep people accountable and to motivate people, and then also funding. And so part of the platform is also a community area, which we're just about to relaunch to enable people to track their progress and connect easier. And then the membership revenue will establish an action fund from which members can eventually apply for grants in order to start and scale their restoration projects. So those are sort of the ways that we're trying to remove these obstacles in order to help support a mass mobilized and peer-driven nature restoration movement, which Earth sees itself as just a very small part in a very big ecosystem of organizations that are working towards that.
Amazing. Hello, cool. Yeah, that sounds great, and thank you for inviting me on this stage. It's a pleasure to hold this space with everyone here. So I set up Roots allotments 3 growing seasons ago, after coming across much difficulty in trying to get access to land to grow on for an allotment perspective. As we sort of have gone on in the journey, we've uncovered many other barriers to getting people on land, but I'm sure we'll come along onto those. But essentially, the vision of Roots is to find private agricultural land and launch growing communities on it. Now, these are growing communities who practice no-dig, they practice chemical-free growing, and we also look to take part in a number of nature restoration projects that are on-site, as well as connecting with other local food producers around each location to take part in nature restoration projects with them, or enable our members to get a wider perspective of what agriculture and food growing is on a slightly larger level than a little allotment patch. But we just want to make growing as accessible to people as possible. So people can basically set up a monthly or a yearly fee with us, and we'll give you the seeds, the tools, the plants, and over 100 online educational videos to get you going, as well as over 30 in-person experiences where we can educate people on how to sow a seed, how to prick out, how to pot on, how to identify weeds, how to make compost. There's a list as long as my arm that we we want to enable people to not be put off growing. Now, I think council allotments are incredible. They're an amazing social asset, but the UK is suffering from really, really high waiting lists, which is meaning that every year you wait on a list is a growing season you'll never, ever get back again. So some people, if they wait 8 years and they've never sown a seed before, they'll come to a council allotment. It'll be 6 foot high with weeds, 120 plus square meters, and you'll spend hours and hours and hours and weekends clearing it. And then you might finally sow your first seed and that might fail, and that could potentially put you off. And I think growing is a really beautiful middle ground for us to get back in touch with nature, understand the earth a lot better, and also then connect with other like-minded people to push for progressive change.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. So I feel really, really passionately about the fact that everyday people are really essential. It's really essential that we remember who we are as a species and remember our power to change things. I started this journey 8 years ago. I was really depressed and angry with humanity. I'm pretty miserable. My friends stopped inviting me to parties. That's how bad it was. They were like, don't invite the angry person to come and tell us off for not recycling. And that's when I discovered ecosystem restoration just by chance. I don't have an academic background in this field. And I saw a documentary that YouTube's algorithm showed me, and it totally changed my life because I saw millions of people in China, the documentary is called Green Gold, being paid by the World Bank to stop overgrazing this area called the Loess Plateau, which is the size of Belgium, massive landscape, totally desertified, silt washing off the land into the Yellow River to the point where you could walk on the river, that bad. And over 20 years, they terraced the land, they planted trees, they stabilized the soil, and they really brought that landscape back to life. And I was like, I had no idea that that was possible. And it totally changed my life. I reached out to the guy who made that documentary on Facebook just by chance and was like, who knows, he might respond, he might not. He did. He invited me to an initial working group to form an organization called Ecosystem Restoration Communities. I know it's a mouthful. ERC is what we call it. And we started with our first site in Spain, the south of Spain, which is really desertified and very degraded. And we started with a little piece of land there, and we were practicing how to restore it. I moved there, uprooted my life, went and lived in this tiny little farm in the middle of nowhere, 8 people living in a 2-bedroom house, total strangers. It was madness, but it was amazing. And slowly over time, I just learned how to do it from an expert coming and teaching us. I'd grown some veg before a little bit, but I'd never really done anything like that. And I learned really quickly, it's not rocket science. It's something that we can all learn to do. And that ERC turned into 4 ERCs, which turned into 8, and it exponentially grew until there are now 70 around the world. And all of these communities are just everyday people, they're not people with PhDs in ecology. And we simply don't have time for people to go through the academic system to get to that level before we start doing something. And we don't need to be either. You don't need to have that level of education to do it. I'm a living example of that. And not only that, but it also really touches something deep in us, that this is our true nature, and part of what the ERC does is it provides trainings for people. It provides volunteering opportunities. If you go on our website, there's a whole suite of different ways that you can get involved. You can go and volunteer at all of these different places around the world. We have 2 nationwide trainings, one on rewilding, some rewilding training students in the house, woo woo! And I'm just about to start one on regenerative agriculture that's specifically for people who are not currently farmers. And that sort of training doesn't yet exist. So that's really exciting. If you're interested to find out more, I've put some contact details at the front here. That starts next year. Yeah, this is the great work of our time. It needs millions of us. And it's so fulfilling. It's so rewarding. It's so beautiful to see people come and feel really empowered to learn how to do this. Some of the rewilding training students, after 1 year, they're already starting their own rewilding projects. They're becoming rewilding consultants. They're getting paid jobs with people like the National Trust. This movement over the last 8 years has grown so much, and there's so many opportunities out there, paid ones. So if this is really speaking to you, then now is your moment. And the ERC is something that can really help you get there. I know I'm taking up too much time. And the last thing is, I'm just about to start a new charity that's going to support people to buy land together to do rewilding and regenerative agriculture. So if you're someone who really wants to buy some land, but you can only afford an acre or so, come and talk to me or grab one of my cards, because there's an opportunity for you to buy 80 acres with a group of people and get on the land that way. Thank you.
I'm a bit of a sort of magpie collector of interests. So as well as doing Lawyers for Nature, I've also set up a charity in East London called the River Roading Trust, and I've also been involved in Right to Roam. And one of the good things about being a magpie is that you kind of end up drawing the connections between things. And a connection that I've clearly drawn is that the exclusion of the majority of people in these lands from the majority of lands is intimately connected to the destruction of nature that we see here. And thanks. Wasn't necessarily expecting a clap there. And I've recently contributed to a book called Wild Service with the rest of the Right to Roam team. And my chapter was called From Ownership to Guardianship. And it starts out by saying effectively that in this country, currently, those who have own land, which includes myself, I own a bit of riverbank in Kent, have too much power to destroy nature. There's far too much power to be damaging and destructive, and that actually land ownership in this country needs to move far more into the idea of guardianship, seeing ourselves as guardians of the land and not as a kind of traditional role of those who can do whatever they want to it. But then I suddenly realized that there's a flip side to that as well. Because at the moment, if we have landowners on one side who have far too much power, we have other people who have far too little power. And actually, we need to move both of them more into the centre, into this concept of guardianship. Because if landowners can become guardians, then I believe that those who don't own land can also become guardians as well. To put it another way, the concept of nature guardianship could be a key way to engage more people in the restoration of nature in these lands. And there's many different examples. I probably won't go into them now. They might come in a later different question. But as an example of something that I did with that, I moved to the River Roding in East London on my boat, and I don't own any of the land there. I didn't have any permission from any official authority to go there and to do anything. I just literally moved there and said, I'm now doing this thing. And my duty here is to act as a guardian for this river, speak for its interests, fight for those interests against those who would destroy her. And that's what I've done for the last 6 years. And, the Environment Agency's raised a few eyebrows, but ultimately doesn't feel able to stop me doing things. And by having that idea of guardianship in my mind, not only is it really accessible, because anyone could have done what I did, anyone could have done it, it also actually, I think, it gives me a greater power to speak for nature. And that idea of anyone being able to do it is crucial, because I think moving on a boat to start a charity to restore a river is quite bold, but other people are doing very similar things. Around the country, who is it who's standing up to the water companies destroying our rivers? It's by and large not the big charities, it's ordinary local people who see themselves as guardians and are doing water testing and campaigning and things like that. They are the radicals defending. When trees are threatened around the country, it's often just local people standing up saying, I see myself as a guardian of this tree and I will fight to protect it. So I believe there's a key role that if we can get many more people to see themselves as guardians of nature in these lands, that's a real way to get them involved in its protection.
Good morning. I don't know about you guys, but I've been sitting here for the last 5 minutes and I'm feeling so inspired by the speakers. And so I'm feeling charged up and excited to be here at Groundswell. It's my first year, but I was hearing about it last year and feeling like I was missing out. So it's a real honor to be here with you guys. So my journey, I sort of related to Ash, is I grew up in London, very disconnected, I'd say, from sort of natural ecosystems and growing food particularly. And about 6 years ago, I was deep into my studies at university, and I was reading as much as I could about the environment and the climate crisis. And the more I read, the more I wanted to go deeper into it. But the deeper I went, the more depressed and so I became, and sort of at a loss of how I could make an impact. And Earthrise was the first sort of product of trying to do something with the heaviness of this knowledge and a desire to connect people to this issue. It's a media company that I started with my brother and Alice Adey, who's a filmmaker. At the time, she was working on migration issues, climate refugees, and we started to understand the sort of like intrinsic link between the climate crisis, forced migration, and the sort of multiple systemic issues. We talk about this idea of a polycrisis that we're facing now. It's so muddy and complex, particularly for young people. We were asking the question, what does it look like to create a space and a platform that makes these issues a little bit easier to understand? Like for me, that's the starting point. And so Earthrise grew really in the middle of the pandemic as a place to try and unpick these issues and try and make them more accessible for young people. And that's been growing over the last couple of years. And through that journey, I became really interested in regenerative culture. And this for me was a huge shift, having been, feeling very daunted about where we're headed, to suddenly reading about a way of acting and being based on indigenous practices that can not only sort of sustain us into the future, but actually create a much more beautiful and biodiverse place than the one we were born into. And that led me into regenerative agriculture, which is still today probably the best example of a sort of practical application of regenerative thinking and design. And so more recently, in the last 2 years, I've been involved with the purchase of 20 hectares of land in the middle of Ibiza, of all places, which is a fascinating microcosm of what happens to food systems when globalization takes hold. Ibiza as an island used to be totally self-sufficient, and now less than 4% of the food that's consumed there is grown on the island. And so 2 years ago, we had the opportunity as a small group of people to buy an old dairy farm. And it's just a classic example of an industrial site that was, just sort of operated to the point of collapse, essentially. It was shut down because it was no longer making profit. There were hundreds of cattle. There was an abattoir on site, and they used to sort of produce as many hamburgers as they could. And we bought the site after 10 years of it being left vacant. And we are now building a project and a master plan that's centered around 3 key processes. And the whole idea is bringing people into the space of regenerative agriculture and food growing. We have cultivation, so we have an 8-hectare farm. We have transformation, so we inherited 12 large agricultural sheds. And one of the major issues that's slowing down local food production in Ibiza is transformation spaces. So we are building infrastructure to support growers and producers and transforming food. And then lastly, community. So we are building a sort of town square in the middle of this site. It's right in the middle of the island. And, if you go back to the sort of Greek agora, the marketplace, the meeting place, the gathering place where people exchanged ideas and produce, that's something that we feel is missing in the heart of this community. And so it's a very ambitious project. We've just closed a €6 million round, a Series A round, to be able to begin this kind of work. And we've been very lucky to be supported by these sort of 20 investors who are backing the project. But the whole idea is to create a physical space. My work started in the digital space, and that's one way to reach people at scale. But for me, I found myself really drawn to physical land, as I'm sure many of us here here are, and to creating a physical space for people to come and to gather and to learn, and to more than just, it's not just about growing food, it's about understanding the full food economy. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, we often think about just the growing side of it, but of course, a regenerative economy requires the full food supply chain to transform. And so we are trying to demonstrate what that looks like across the board. Yeah, you can find both those projects online, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go.
Thank you, everyone. Incredible. It's so empowering to hear what each of you are doing to make nature restoration and agroecology more accessible. We really do need a mass mobilized movement in order to address the crisis that we're facing today. And so each of you are doing your part in that, and we'll dive in more to the specifics. So Christabel, I would love to hear from you. With Earthed, you are hoping to make nature restoration as popular as gardening. What obstacles have you faced in that process, and how are you addressing them?
Thank you. So we only actually launched last year, and it's been wild to have only been live for a year and already have so many members. So that's been great, and I feel like we are really building and building in momentum. I think maybe the biggest obstacle to getting nature restoration, like as in the mind of people who, I'll start again. I think one of the biggest obstacles we face to the climate and ecological crisis is the fact that we see it as a crisis, which obviously it is, but also the solutions to the crisis are also the solutions that can pave a way towards happier, healthier, just and liberated futures. And so I think a massive obstacle is getting people like really on board on those solutions. And I think previously, for the past, 20, 30 years, the ecological movement's been really focused on raising awareness and ringing the alarm bell, and we had to do that. But now I feel that we're not building momentum that much anymore, because we're continuing to do that without actually enabling people to go from awareness into action. So when people think about the climate crisis, they think about carbon and they think about sustainable consumption. Both important things, of course, but how do we get people to, like Ash was saying, and also Paul touched on as well, like reawaken to what it means to be human, to be an ecological citizen, part of your environment, to be able to learn from the millions of land workers, indigenous peoples, local people who are still practicing traditional ecological knowledge. And so it's like it's like, without sounding too hippie, it's like a paradigm shift. It's like, I think the biggest obstacle, it's like getting people to realize that don't wait for the governments to restore your local ecosystem. Like Paul was saying, you don't need to be an ecologist. You can learn from people like Paul and other people how to go and do it yourself. So I think for me, it's about the biggest obstacle is people awakening to their human potential. And I don't see this as sort of like an imaginative process. It's actually learning from the people who have awoken to their human potential and seeing it as a real path of carving out meaning, joy, connection, health, all of these things that we're seeking in our lives, but through the localized impact of nature restoration or food growing and community building. So I think it will continue to be our biggest obstacle, but also our greatest opportunity.
Thank you. And so, Ed, Roots allotment. It was born out of a need to address the long waiting lines in the UK for access to allotments. How did you go about addressing that? How are you democratizing access to space to grow food?
Okay, so yeah, we find private land and we make it so, for instance, one farmer may have farmed this field beforehand, and now we can launch a community of 300 to 600 people potentially on it, who can all meet each other, learn a new skill, and then have a wider impact in the community surrounding them. So our biggest challenge has been access to land and finding suitable land to grow on. If you look at what's happened to our cities and the allotment sites on cities and green spaces, community gardens, they are few and far between. So what we realize is that we would have to look sort of on city boundaries in peri-urban environments at the green belt that is sort of surrounding our urban environments. And I think as I've sort of as we've gone down the path of realizing just how hard it is to access land, which is, I don't know, a 20-minute cycle from a city area, or also have a public transport network to it, we've realized that our options has become very, very reduced to where we can launch our allotment sites. To sort of add to that, it's like everyone's ideal would be to walk to their allotment. Like that would be an absolutely amazing thing to want to do, and probably something that happened back in the day when we had 1.5 million of them in 1945, when we had the No Dig for Victory movement. And it was interesting that humans were killing humans then, and humans are harming nature and humans now, and we need this sort of revitalization of that mentality where the councils look at public spaces and they go, yeah, let the people grow on it. We look at agricultural land and we see how many market gardens can we launch around a city, how many allotment sites can we launch around a city. I think until people start connecting with the earth, we're not going to solve the problems that are facing us. I'd say the biggest challenge that we have come across in the subject of access to land is that we use a piece of technology where we can look at a lot of the fields around cities, and you can click on them, you can get the information of who owns the deed, and then you can sort of send them a letter and you can go, hey, would you like to launch a growing community on your field? And the sad reality is that about 90% of Greenbelt has been bought with housing options on. We talk to a landowner, they basically go, sorry, we've got an option which we're going to make £3 to £20 million out of this field, and we go, sorry, we can only offer you a similar rate to solar. So yeah, like trying to find where we can grow our food is a really big problem. For instance, in Bristol, you've got 8,000 people on a waiting list. If the council were going to find the land to give everyone a half-size plot, it's like 250 to 350 acres of land. That doesn't exist within cities anymore. So yeah, just trying to have a conversation about what land should we grow on, where should we grow, how is it accessible to urban people, and because we'll get onto this, a lot of people have moved to urban environments, so then where can we get our green space to grow on? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ash, as someone who's training people to become ecosystem restorers and regenerative farmers and growers, what are some key challenges you found in this mission, and how are you measuring your successes?
I haven't found it to be that challenging, which is nice. I guess the things that are like the trainings that we have launched have been really popular, and that has been wonderful. You know, the teachers that we've reached out to have really seen that there's a need for these sorts of learning experiences that are more kind of pop than going to university, and you know, they're not very expensive relatively. They're based around people who have full-time jobs. So the formats of them is that once a week on a Monday night, you have a 2-hour Zoom call. And then 3 times a year, you have 4-day weekends where you come train in person. So they're flexible and fairly inexpensive. You know, you're looking at like £2,000 for a 9-month course, whereas if you think about PDC's 2 weeks, permaculture design certificate, 2 weeks, and costs are, you know, just about the same amount. So we haven't had a problem with finding people who want to teach. Everyone's been like, oh yeah, this is what we've been missing, amazing, really excited. And we haven't had a problem with selling them either. I would say the main thing that's challenging is there are still a lot of people out there who can't afford to pay £2,000. And the demographic of the students are still middle-class white people, you know? We need more funding to subsidise the costs is the main challenge, and also maybe a bit more capacity to be able to train more people, because we can only really train 50 people a year. And there's so many more that want to join, you know, there are waiting lists, etc. So I say those are the main challenges. Although what was really beautiful about last year's rewilding training was that some of the students put their own money into a pot to subsidise lower income people to take it, which is so heartwarming and gorgeous. And now we do have some like more diverse students, people who are younger and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So long may that continue and grow. How do we measure the impact? Well, I think the purpose of the trainings is to empower people to do this for a living, because I really feel like, you know, all of us here are doing this because we do it for a living. I'm not saying we wouldn't do it otherwise, but it's so much easier to commit properly when it's your job, right? And you're being paid for it and you're not trying to do it in your spare time. So I'd say that is one of the main things that we're looking at, is like how many people have actually gone and started managing land to rewild it. And you can either volunteer or you can either like work for a wildlife trust, for instance, or the National Trust, or Rewilding Britain, or there are lots of different organisations now out there. Or you can become a consultant, people pay you. We've got some people managing land facilitation funds, which are like groups of landowners getting access to payments from the government. So I'd say that with the rewilding training, it's people actually doing rewilding and ideally getting paid for it. And we are seeing that, which is so gratifying. And then for the rewilding, for the regenerative agriculture training, it will be people becoming regenerative farmers. That's the name of the training, becoming a regenerative farmer. So the number of people that actually step in and do that, whether they're starting their own farm or whether they're becoming a tenant farmer on someone else's farm. Because there's a lot of farmers out there that are interested in this, but maybe they don't, you know, they need more staff. So there's opportunities there as well. So yeah, I think I answered your questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And so, Paul, you have a unique perspective on this panel as a lawyer. I would love to hear more about your work with rights for nature and how the law can be a key component of addressing exactly what we're talking about and making nature restoration more accessible and widespread.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people know here about rights of nature. I don't want to sort of go into too much depth in it, but effectively rights of nature is a movement that says that nature should be the subject, not the object of rights. So actually it should be given legal rights and also legal personhood. So effectively the right to participate in our legal system. And I've been campaigning for that for a number of years. And over the last couple of years, I very much realised that actually it's not just about the legal system. It's also about putting nature into our political systems, our economic systems, our social systems, pretty much every way that you can think of that humans relate to each other. We need to find ways that we can also relate to nature and give nature a voice in that. And I do somewhat fear that if we don't do that, that even maybe well-meaning projects could potentially end up damaging nature. And so one of the things that we have been doing at Lawyers for Nature is a project called Nature on the Board, where we put nature onto a nature director onto the board of companies to actually represent nature's voice in the interests, in the management and of that company, which has been a very quite revolutionary thing for the companies that have done that. And this year I've been leading a project to extend that to third sector organisations and to charities, quangos and CICs, so that even those organisations which ostensibly are doing good things, so pretty much I guess everyone at this festival ostensibly trying to do a good thing, how would it be different if nature was actually genuinely represented in your decision making? And how would it affect the projects that you're doing? And I guess as an example with the roots thing, there's some controversies around a site on the edge of Bristol where roots have set up an allotment, and local people have said that that's damaged skylark habitat, and actually it was a perfectly good meadow before the allotments were put there. Now, obviously there's some quite complex issues there, balancing the need for humans to grow food and the need to get more people involved in growing food with the interests of nature for nature's space, nature's right to exist. How do we balance those? Well, I think it would be a really great way, for instance, to have nature's voice taken into account in each of the projects that we're doing. So, if nature was a director in Roots, or a nature director was in Roots, they could actually talk it through and say, actually, okay, is this the best site for growing versus the interests of the skylarks? And if it is, then how can we best manage the needs of the need to grow food there with the interests of skylarks and other creatures and work it through? And I think there's probably no project that wouldn't benefit from having nature's voice represented in its decision-making and its processes. And I think it's just as crucial in organizations that are ostensibly the good guys trying to do the good things. That seems important to me.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. So think of your questions. Finn, I'd love for you to say a few words on why design and storytelling come in as a key component to making exactly what we're talking about more accessible. But then we'll pass it over to questions.
Can I speak to barriers? Because I'd love to riff off some things that were said. And,
definitely.
Okay. I think it's helpful. I mean, there are two issues we've been addressing in the project that I'm working on now at Hunter's Farm. One, and I think many of us will face this in different ways. One is the scale of the ambition of what we're trying to achieve, and the way we have found to make that easier is to break it down into stages or phases. And so we have a 5 to 10 year sort of master plan of where we would like to end up, and we've broken that down into 4 phases. And the key barriers to us realizing that are one is economic, raising the funds to make the transformations that we have in mind, and the other is political, so being able to receive the licensing and the permissions to transform the site in the way we would like to. And the way we've approached this, and we're starting to see the benefits of this, is we've created a phase 1, which is the sort of conversion of 1 building on site and a sort of quarter of the farm, and that's enabled us to sort of reduce the amount of capital requirement for the project and start to experiment with the ideas behind it, and then create a space we can bring people to and show them what it looks like when we integrate these ideas onto the farm, or when we transform one of these buildings into a space for food transformation. So I think this idea of having a phased approach to the transformation we need is key in order to creating demonstratable case study sites. What was the other point I was going to respond to? No, it's gone. Your question was on storytelling and design, right? Yeah. Well, this is the key. I mean, I see this in this festival here as well. It's we really need to break. My idea of farming growing up was that it was sort of twofold. One was food seemed to magically appear in supermarkets in plastic bags, and the other was if I imagined where it came from, it was probably a farmer on a red tractor somewhere with a straw hat on. And so we really need to break down these deeply embedded cultural stereotypes of farming, and make it expand our awareness of as I said before, beyond just growing food into the full food supply chain. I think design and storytelling have a real power in creating transparency in that process, and we can't make a change until we know the reality of what the current processes look like. So I think they're both really powerful tools, and I see them being used in different ways in the projects of the people here on this panel. And I see this happening here at Groundswell, and I'm sure in the projects you guys are working on, is it takes us to come together to start to have these conversations, to sit here and spend our day when there are so many other things we could be doing, listening and conversing and challenging each other as well, on how we're doing our projects and what this transition needs to look like. So I think we really need to keep investing in the storytelling and opening up this conversation and bringing it to a wider audience of people as well. That's key to getting this from a niche movement into a mass mobilized movement.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel. And so we'll open it up to you all. We probably have time for a few questions. I see a quick hand back there with the hat on. Go ahead. Yep. Coming.
Thank you, guys. That was incredibly inspiring to listen to, and to really get the sense of action happening to follow ideas. My question is about finance and money in the world of business, and that's been touched on a little bit with some of the responses. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on navigating kind of the need to channel energy and finance and resources into making these projects thrive, and how to kind of navigate the kind of risk of corporate capture and I guess the narrative, Finn, you were kind of referring to there, like how to kind of work with investors, work with big business in such a way that we can kind of get to a space where these are thriving, but in a way that's not kind of, destroying as well. So
I'm happy to kick off on that just off the bat. So that's a great question. So we have an approach at Huntos. So we think we need to raise 20 million euros to realize the project, which is so daunting I can barely say it out loud. And the way the simple framework we've put in place to achieve that is a triple approach. So the goal is to raise 1/3 of the funding from investors, 1/3 from grants, and 1/3 from debt. And we can do that specifically in our project because we have a asset that is an asset-backed project because we've been able to buy the land and it has infrastructure existing on it. The easiest place to start was with investors. We found 20 people who had an excess of capital. These are people who have become aware of the detrimental impact of how they've made their money, and they're willing to, at this point, it's almost philanthropy. They're taking a gamble, and that's the first 6 million that came through there. We're now deep in the grant process, aiming to receive most of the money from the European Union, from EIT as a huge partner that we've been working with. One of the barriers we've had, which is the thing I forgot earlier I want to talk about, is one of the challenges we will all find, and we need to find a solution for this, is how you show impact and change over time. So when we're applying for grants or any investment, people want to know when they put the money there, what is the return they're going to see? And of course, we're not talking about economic return here. That's the sort of problem that's led us to where we are. We need to be measuring return of biodiversity, of carbon sequestration, of water retention. And this is a huge challenge for us. It's something that we are really aware we need to deliver in order to receive that support. But there is a real lack of, and I hope to find more of this here and connect with other people on this, there's a lack of metrics and tools to show that change over time. And I think if we can get better at creating a dashboard of seeing those impacts and change, then we will be able to leverage better funding because there's something tangible that we can show that happens in return for that capital. But yeah, so for me, it's like it can never be a solo approach to raising financing. We need to be going for government bodies. We need to be going for private investors and very carefully debt as well from institutional investors. I don't know if anyone else was.
Well, maybe we'll take one more question just so people have the chance. Thank you. I saw you raise your hand first right here in the front. And just a reminder, the panelists will stick around for a bit, and so we'll run out of time, but feel free to ask specific questions afterwards.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you for all speaking. And I was really inspired by your different backgrounds and how that speaks to the kind of everyone a change maker world that we want to create, that everyone in their role can be powerful. So thank you all for sharing. My question is around access to land. I work with Common Land Foundation, so it's kind of in the name. You spoke, Ed, to that being one of your biggest struggles. Ash, you spoke to starting a charity around this issue. And Finn, you have access to land, but Ibiza and Mallorca, that's one of the biggest struggles for young people entering into farming and regenerative agriculture. National Trust has a stand here focused on this question. And I'm wondering, beyond the citizen and the consumer, what do you see as potential for collaboration between organizations like yourselves at that level up for working on that issue and finding ways forward?
Yeah. So Roots as an organisation looks to empower more people to get on the land. So when I was speaking to someone last week actually, he said that they got offered a half-acre market garden, and the rent on that was like £5,000 a year. From like half an acre market garden, you're probably if you're pushing it, you're going to make 50k a year, maybe a little bit more. So like to have that huge chunk of money taken out as rent payment is massive, considering that when people get into market gardening, they also struggle to pay their first year wages. They basically work for free and they're trying to figure out their business model. So because we're in a lucky position where we do raise funding to get 25-year-long leases, we can then look at that land and go, how can we repurpose it and do interesting different things with it? So, for instance, on our Croydon location, we're setting up a 2-acre market garden with a CIC called Black Farmers Market. We're not charging them any rent. They pay £1 a year. And we basically have advisors within our network who have monthly calls with them. So we can then set up for success in 2025. Roots is looking to do this on pretty much every location that we launch above 15 acres because of the difficulties that we've heard from many different people up and down the country, whether it's a community project, a commercial project. There tends to be difficulties with access, planning, and also opposition. So we're trying to, land is liberty, and it has been locked up for such a long time now. It's about getting as many people back on the land and trying to figure out how we can grow our food in an interesting way whilst also supporting natural systems around us.
Thank you. How are we on time? But, okay, one more question right here. Thanks.
Thanks. I have a question about terminology. So this session was pitched with the term agroecology in the title, agroecology, accessible for all. But agroecology is a really well-defined term. And in fact, a lot of the things we're doing here at Groundswell wouldn't really be considered agroecology based on the principles. So, and I can see the benefit of having a really well-defined term. It's less likely to be co-opted, where something like regen ag that's a little bit more nebulous is a bit more accessible. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this, on how important having defined terms are, or more open terms that maybe are more accessible.
I'll kick off on this. This is such a good question. This is something I started looking at through an academic lens when I was getting into this issue. Like, what is regenerative agriculture? What is agroecology? What is, there's so many different types of terminology that comes under these different biodynamic farming, permaculture. Like, where do these things overlap and how are they different? There is a real risk and a danger currently with regen ag in the sense that it is not regulated and it doesn't have a defined framework. This is something that we have been talking a lot about. Hunsos, we've started making products from the farm and we put regenerative and organic onto those products. Organic, we know we're certified, that's no problem. But what is regenerative? It's a real question that we need to answer and define, because it will, and it already is, being co-opted by huge food companies who are happily slapping that label on because they know consumers are interested. I think we need to create a much stronger definition of what it entails. It's place specific, and that's really important. But I think this is an issue that we should be unpacking and challenging here at Groundswell, because there's a risk of losing the potency and the power of these practices if we're not putting in strong frameworks for them. But yeah, we use regenerative. Agroecology, I would say, is the overriding one that encompasses a lot of those different practices. But yeah, we need a stronger framework on this for sure, because that's a real risk.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually go back, if possible, to the money question earlier on, because I didn't actually get a chance to answer that. I get the practical reality of the system we're in, but I also wonder, is it good to fully surrender to that? And should we maybe try and fight it a little bit and not make everything about money? I think earlier on someone said we're all paid. Actually, I'm not paid at all for the work I do on the river. It's completely voluntary. And yet I noticed that at every meeting I go to, I'm the only one in the room who's not being paid to be there. And I'm also the only one speaking radically on behalf of the river, because many people, by being paid, are completely co-opted. Thames 21 get money from the water companies, therefore don't completely stand up to them, etc., etc., etc. And we've also made reference to indigenous peoples. Are the indigenous peoples around the world who are doing beyond anyone else to safeguard the last remnants of wild nature, are they doing that because they're getting a paycheck? No, they're doing it because it's their sacred duty as humans to steward, guardian nature. And I think we need to lean into that a little bit as well, and not just fully to surrender to the idea that everything has to have a pound sign at the end of it.
Yes. Thank you. That is our time, everyone. And so I really appreciate you all being here. The panelists, if you're willing to step over to the side over here, we'll let them set up for the next round. But if you have more questions, feel free to talk to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.